You're listening to the Women Talking About Learning podcast. My name is Andrew Jacobs. Welcome. Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode, the community one of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I mentioned last week how great these recordings have been, and this one is no exception. We aim to make each episode about 30 minutes or so, but that's a bit of a nominal number. Thankfully, because this one goes over that. Not because it's too long, it's because the conversation is so good. Our guests this week are Nicky Hoyland and Emma Roberts. Nicky is CEO and co-founder of Huler, and she describes herself as a tech, UX and data nerd. She has an unwavering passion for people and for a people-first approach to work technology. If you haven't caught it, her session at the Learning Technology Digital Experience last week is an excellent watch, and the links, as always, will be in the show notes. Our second guest is Emma Roberts. Emma is Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Chester and Director of Learning, Teaching and Transition. That's as well as being the Vice Chair of Tythen Mon, a charity which has been supporting adults with learning disabilities. Settle in to listen to two really smart people having a really smart conversation. This is Women Talking About Learning. This is Nicky and Emma talking about community.
Hi Emma, how you doing? Nice to get to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
I'm good, thank you, Nicky. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. It's a Friday when we're doing this recording, so storming into the weekend, and I'm pretty happy that get to have a couple of days to unwind a bit. I think we were talking ahead of this call that sometimes it can be a bit relentless, can't it, in terms of work, and having the opportunity to switch off a touch.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to be talking about this subject with you, actually, because in the kind of midst of the busyness of a week, you don't necessarily get time out to reflect on these broader issues. So it's lovely to have this chat with you, Nicky.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think the topic itself and us getting to connect and know each other and have the opportunity to talk ahead of this call and hopefully extend our relationship after today is part of that community aspect, right? That I think we've enabled over the pandemic more of these connections that are intentional and looking at different ways to connect and explore with each other. But I was sort of thinking, and as we were talking earlier, is what's some of the best ways to kick off the conversation? And I guess some of that's, what does community mean to us in both broadly and in the context of today's conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting having had the discussion beforehand, and I think to a certain degree we're kindred spirits in that we view these things from the same perspective and have capitalised on opportunities to broaden our connections and therefore, by virtue of that, our communities, I guess, over the last year. But it's really interesting that we both come from very different perspectives on this, actually, because me being purely an educator, my focus on building an online community has been to be able to give something to my students to engage with over the last year. First of all, pivoting online, taking our students to an online community that they wouldn't have experienced before, but then come October 2020 thinking, right, this has to be, and I think the term we've used a number of times is purposeful and intentional, so that there's something for the students to be able to feel a part of in the absence of a physical environment where they can actually see us live and breathe the school community as such. And of course, you're coming from a more commercial perspective, but there seemed to me a lot of synergies in what we perceive to be community, and how we as kind of leaders maybe within that role can help engage our users, whether they be students or whether they be consumers.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because there's so many consistent themes, isn't there, regardless of whether we're talking about online communities that are one that you actively go and seek out yourself and then you're part of and you learn from, that's not necessarily steered or led by your organisation or your educational institution, or whether that's part of what your work provide for you, or the course that you're part of provides for you, or as a leader being involved with other leaders or other people that have the shared interest with yourself. I think the important thing to remember there is the commonality across it all is that we're talking about human beings connecting. So we're not talking about algorithms. We're not talking about just soulless posts. We're talking about how people find connection, or people find connection, and how you build on that. And as we talked about, how you make that intentional and purposeful, that you're not just throwing something out into the ether and then you're sat kind of waiting, and then there's a bit of digital anxiety that can creep in around how long might it take for somebody to reply and how am I perceived. And I think one of the discussions that we started to pull out a touch before was, how do you initiate that sense of community such that it comes from a person with a sense of purpose and drive and goal for the group, but doesn't feel like forced fun, doesn't feel like, oh, you have to have done these certain things at this certain point, and this is how frequently you have to check in, or this is the medium even that you need to do it in. Because we are all, some of us will want to sit back and observe, some will want, take a little bit of time to connect and start to find their place within the community. And then that's probably an interesting part of that commonality, being human beings. But then how do we look at the different points of view and perspective of each individual to try to go, well, this is how you embrace that community metric, that it is about us all. It isn't about one. It's about that shared voice and shared goal, I guess. That I found it so interesting, your analogy that you gave, and I won't steal your thunder there. I thought it was beautifully put. So I'll hand over to you with the clipboard.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that you've mentioned there, which we didn't actually come to, I guess, in our previous conversation about, you use the word human beings. And I think that's so key in understanding or beginning to generate thought about building a community online, which is that we're bringing human beings from the concept of community in a physical existence and trying to bring that online. And so what's really important there is the connectivity, as you say, and this I think is really where the synergy comes out in our understanding and our philosophy maybe behind the building of community, in so much that this last year I took lessons forward from that initial pivot to online learning, engaged with a tremendous amount of continued professional development over the summer to look to create a learning design for my students come October that gave them a connected learning experience, so that despite the fact that I was simply a face on the screen to students joining us at the university for the very first time, that I was connecting with them. And I think the key to that is being present in their online world. And that beckons them to also be present and feel connected in that same way. Because ultimately what we're striving for is for them to identify and feel a sense of belonging within that community, which is a new community to them. And so it's really interesting your perspective on this, because I don't know that I had consciously thought about the lessons learned from those more open communities that we engage with in a commercial or consumer setting, and how those behaviours play out within the learning community as well. We were talking about your involvement with companies and how you're helping to prepare them for that. Ultimately that community is open to the world at large, essentially, isn't it, in a digital sense, whereas the community that we were thinking about in an education setting is really kind of limited in terms of we know who those individuals are. And I think that the clipboard analogy that you were talking about, I think there are two ways of looking at this. So in terms of ensuring that the students are engaging, it's about being the one on the bus, if you will, and calling out those names before that bus leaves town again with a trip, and ensuring that everybody's back on the bus before you take off. But also the second element of that is, building a community. To my thinking, that the philosophy that goes to the heart of my approach to teaching is, when I used to teaching in the physical classroom and still the same now in an online community, I always think that there is as much to be learned from my perspective from my students as they can learn from my imparting of knowledge upon them, even if it's just a word or a behaviorism or just understanding somebody else's culture, albeit what I've put to them is the subject knowledge. And I think that's so important in an online community in particular, because building a community is about putting the hammer in the hand of one person and the paintbrush in the hand of another, and for that online community to be the product of your co-creation, which goes to the heart of kind of social constructivism of knowledge acquisition as well.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I absolutely love, and we'll probably share it, the analogy of, you know, everybody, some people will have the hammer, some people will have the paintbrush, but actually it's about that shared goal, and that sense of we are all in this together, and how that might need the person with the clipboard to lead that slightly, but it is about the team dynamic rather than a hierarchical dynamic. I think it's so interesting what you say there around how we move that to online as well. I mean, my background's HR tech. I'm a huge HR tech nerd, love all things work tech. It's what the business that I'm in, and the customers that we work with, it's, you know, how they provide digital to their people, is that true blend of hybrid. And I think one of the things we talked about earlier, and I've spoken a lot about over the past 14-15 months, is having to do these things during a lockdown when you can't have that face-to-face interaction, versus how hybrid comes together outside and away from the pandemic, are two very, very different things. And I think we're starting to decouple now, actually, how do we embrace this future of work or future of learning or future of community and experience and digital experience that is removed from the pandemic and takes all of the learnings that we've gone through, but doesn't anymore rely on this, in my opinion, a little bit of laziness of, well, we're just going to smash face-to-face into the construct of digital and just hope that it works, because inevitably it doesn't, right? And I think now the lockdown has started to ease, that's where you start to see this blend where actually we can use face-to-face and we use being together in the same space to be about connection, about intentional time together that builds relationship, it builds rapport, that's a lot easier outside of just a digital community when it's around 6 times the amount of interactions digitally versus face-to-face to build the same sense of trust with an individual. But I think there's so much we can learn about. I mean, you and I wouldn't have had the opportunities to do this pre-pandemic. I've made friends and connections and colleagues digitally that you adapt, right, inside this digital space that isn't just how you would always do things from a face-to-face capacity. I think one of the things that we touched on and I'm hugely passionate about is widening that lens. So because we are now with multiple different people across, you know, a distributed geography, different mediums, different backgrounds, we get to experience other people's point of view and other people's worlds and be invited into other people's homes and work day. And even though you may not always share the same opinion, perhaps as somebody, it's good to get their perspective, because if you're only ever in your own community bubble and you're only ever surrounded by people that believe what you believe or have the same learning styles even, or the same personality types as you, or have the same interests, your world will only ever be what you see.
Absolutely.
And I think that power of reach just enables that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's such a lot, isn't there, about diversity. But what is it that we actually mean by diversity? Surely by virtue of community bringing together different social economic groups, different cultures, you know, there's such a lot to be learned there. And I think in terms of an education community, I think that's something I've really embraced this year. And also resilience and tolerance of diversity is really important, so that you're setting standards within that community of what level of conduct is okay, because you're not in a physical environment where you can tap somebody's shoulder and say, do you know what, that's not okay here, that's not how we do things. If there is any level of intolerance, and I think community is about that compassion and care for others and being aware of different perspectives. I just want to take it back for a second though, in terms of you saying, and it's really struck a chord with me, in terms of you saying, you know, where are we moving forward from here? I mean, the reality is, in whatever context, whether it be commercial or indeed education, we've come such a long way over the last year in terms of what we're doing. And it's arguably, you'd say, well, why were we doing these things in this way before? Because we had the technology to achieve it.
Yeah.
But in terms of, you know, what we have achieved, we've got these communities online now, and now that we're moving towards coming out of lockdown and coming out of the restrictions on our ability to move around and go back, if you will, to the ways that we did things before, it would be silly of us not to embrace just how far we've upskilled ourselves. And I'm certainly finding that in education, because, you know, and it was really an eye-opener to speak to you before this recording about the things that you've achieved in a commercial setting. You know, it almost feels like in the past we've been generating subject knowledge in our students and certainly work-based learning skills in our students, but where we're really preparing them in terms of the digitalized world in which they would ultimately be working at the end of their degrees. So I think we've got greater potential than ever before to achieve that now. And when you say, you know, the initial transition from what we used to do before, you know, the pre-COVID into what we've achieved now, I think my feeling on this was it's not enough, and it's not good enough actually for our students who are ultimately consumers. It's not good enough to say, well, we'll bring online what we did in the classroom. My approach to this has been, we need to throw all the pieces into the air and see where they land, and see what new construction, new jigsaw piece we can create with those pieces to be able to give a really connected learning experience online. And in that regard, I think when you spoke about connectivity and that diversity, we as learning designers as well need to stay connected. And you're quite right, we would never have had this wonderful conversation beforehand if not only because of the logistics of having to come together in the same physical space. That would have been a day out of my work, whereas, you know, we instead are able to draw connections. And I'm already learning a lot about how we can bring conduct and learning from the commercial into the education sector, that we would never have been able to draw upon before, because like you say, it's through LinkedIn and such social media platforms that we're able to find people, not necessarily people that would be in your immediate network, but there's so much learning to be had from one sector to the other.
It's so important that we don't go backwards just because that's what's easier to step back to what we were all perhaps familiar with, and the comfort in how the experiences that we've all gone through over the past sort of 14 months, and how easy it could be to go back to, well, this feels safe and it feels back to something that I know, when actually we forget all of the brilliant things that we've been able to do across a digital space. And I think it's that tech adoption that within the first 3 months of pandemic, we saw the adoption to technology that was equivalent of 3 years. And that wasn't with the tech that changed, it was because people had to change. They had no choice. They had to embrace and adopt something different. And we saw this real surge in people starting to use tools that we would have perhaps used in their personal life inside of work to enable community and enable a gathering in a digital space, and enable commenting and sharing and collaboration that they didn't do before, and vice versa from sort of personal and then into work too. And then these boundaries sort of got crossed slightly. And I think this conversation for me is so interesting because my lens is very much inside the world of work and the future of work. And I think we need to start to look at actually how I interact in personal communities. So whether that's sports teams that I'm a fan of, and I interact with people across social media groups where we all have a shared passion and drive for a certain team, or a certain we're all part of an online cooking group, or whatever that might be, that's again sense of community. How do we look at the social use that's personal into education and then into the world of work, and how do we ensure that the tools that we use feel easy to be quite to be fluid in our lives and grease that conversation to enable the sense of connection and community, rather than some of the tools be a little bit clunky when you move outside of personal and then into work, or outside of personal and into education. I think there's an absolute duty from the tech that we provide that just makes that easy and makes it seamless. We also need to explore different mediums. So I think we're all familiar with face-to-face as a sense of community. We're all familiar with then some kind of instant messaging or channel sort of platform where you can comment and thread and so on. But what about things like Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces that they've started to bring out, actually just voice mediums, where it's a different lens on, it's not text based, it's not video based, but actually we're starting to connect with people in different ways that drop some of the, I guess, the expectation and some of the effort behind either video or text, or allows collaboration with people you wouldn't have ever met because you're not connected to their network. And this is something that's so interesting for me with the sense of community, because many of the platforms we have allow us to connect with people that we know. So they allow us to connect with, you know, either a second connection or a third connection, or a connection that you were already established with, where something like a Clubhouse or open forums do allow that. But, you know, and that extends that lens, doesn't it, of I don't know you, but actually we do have this shared commonality, and we're going to learn from each other, and to pull back from some of what you said earlier, even if that's only a snippet or a word or a post or a blog or something that you can go, actually, that's really interesting to me. I'm gonna go back to that, and then, you know, start to pick that apart in my world as well. So I think we do have that sense of how do we enable technology across communities, but how do we understand that there's different voices, there's different generations, there's different mediums, there's different individuals that we're talking to, and that how do you come out of personal into education, then into a bit of personal, and then into work? It's I think there's a lot going on.
You're drawing a lot of the concepts that I've been kind of thinking about throughout this year, actually, and certainly the kind of designing of the module that I ran intensely at the start of our students' first year in October last year. When you talk about these broader communities, I suppose, you know, we're exchanging knowledge and understanding here right now, and we're connecting on that level. So we found the commonality in really quite diverse worlds of work and what community means to us in those different arenas, if you will. But when you talk about the sport example and so on, and I'm thinking about, you know, the football fan who's now missing the live games, they may go to those games alone, and yet within that stadium there is the idea that, you know, they're a part of that community. So what is the perhaps the X factor that creates that sense, that undercurrent? Well, it's the fact that they can identify with those people around them, and therefore they feel a sense of belonging within that community, and with that comes the feeling of reward, if you like, for if they have turned up alone to that stadium, that they celebrate a goal with those peers next to them, that they create that sense of shared belonging with one another. And I think that too, in an online community, can be replicated. So things like, you know, posting something onto Twitter and getting those likes, that sense of reward, but also that sense of recognition that they exist within that same virtual community at the same time. So that could be synchronous or asynchronous, in so much that you can post something and that may be liked whilst you're sleeping, because that like is coming from Hong Kong maybe, and that you're not in the same community at the same time, but you are achieving that sense of connectivity. And it's really interesting that you do talk about the sports community, because over the last year, what we've actually seen is, you know, for my example, I've been engaging with my students within their scheduled learning sessions and so on, and that they get that connectivity, that reward, that recognition, that which creates a sense of belonging. But actually we've been moving up from one community to another without physically moving at all. So
Right.
just before this call now, I was connecting with my legal academic colleagues in a kind of a social network where we were chatting, and then I came into this call. So we are transforming our own identities from one community to the other, and I think that's really interesting, because it goes back to the idea of diversity, because what I'm bringing to this conversation now is a reflection of what I've just been discussing with my legal academic colleagues.
Yeah, and it's that commonality, isn't it? So you may be a member of a multitude of different communities, but within each of them, there might be commonality that's different, but is shared amongst that collective of people. And I think that, that taking the sport example, one of the things that people have started to look to do, and services such as BT Sport and so on, they've gone, actually, how do we create that sense of experience in a community? Which again ties into education, ties into the world of work, because they've started these watching parties. So now even on like Amazon Prime, you can have a watch party, so that rather than be sat on the sofa with somebody or some friends, we can actually be in this shared space where we do something together. And I think that taps in for me around how community has to have a sense of experience. It has to have a sense of something that's more than just the text I read, the voice I listen to, the information that I take in, because I have to connect with it. I have to have that shared sense of purpose, that shared sense of goal, that shared sense of values or beliefs or what we're all working towards together. But that has to come through in experience. And as we move out of the pandemic, I think how we create experiences in face-to-face will be so key. So as an example, and I talk about this a lot, if you think about the concept of going to the gym, or going to a spin class and drive into the gym and having to go into the changing room, find a parking space, wait for the class, finish the class, use the shower, drive home. You're not going to do that if you can jump on a Peloton and just nip next door and do it. But you are going to do it if you want the sense of experience, because you're meeting a friend, or you're going for lunch, or you're going for coffee, or you want the lights and you want the multitude of people around you to drive and push you. And I think that's what we need to remember across communities, is where across different digital mediums or face-to-face mediums do you bring in that sense of experience and connection with somebody that is very, very intentional. It's not passive. It's everybody collaborating together in a shared voice with a shared sense of purpose. And that for me is what community is, and what learning in community is. It's about that collective goal, and how we all get there, perhaps at different pace, and perhaps through different experience and different lenses, but it is that shared commonality that's perhaps different to taking away learning to do individually, or as community that's more just sort of self-led. I think it's about that how we come together, and how we don't make that forced fun either, because I think that can border a little bit on community too, that it does become a bit of this a forced construct of, oh, this is how frequently we do things, or we'll all get together and do this on this day, that then kind of loses that sense of spirit. That I think that's probably actually quite key in community for me about spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking when you started talking about that, though, in terms of what we do in order to connect with something. Now, when I mentioned earlier, it can be synchronous or asynchronous. We can read a novel and connect with that story, can't we? But I guess in digital terms, we almost need to take that further, so that we're not just, say, reading a particular blog or an article, but that we connect in the forums afterwards. And I think that's the difference, isn't it, between perhaps what we have traditionally viewed to be a community, as opposed to what we view to be an online community now. And when you're talking about the difference between the Peloton and the actual going to the classes, I think what we're hearing increasingly now is that that's what people are missing. You know, I can't wait to go to the gym again so that I can see my friends or whatever. It's not the actual exercise that they're missing, because that can be achieved in different means, but it is that sense of belonging and being able to identify, and shared experiences is a really interesting thing. You know, when I mentioned earlier that I've come just out of a networking a session with other legal academics across the UK, what we're missing is the conferences, but the sharing of knowledge and sharing of good practice can be achieved online. What we're actually missing is the conversations that come out from the coffee breaks, you know, those mutterings that arise from the coffee table, as opposed to the sharing of the presentations and so on. And I'm seeing that in many of the committees that I serve on as well. So yes, we're getting business done, but we're not getting those peripheral conversations that arise from arriving at the same time, arriving a bit early, having those conversations, albeit about the weather at times. But those are the things that are shared within the community. And I just wonder, in terms of your thoughts then on, does building a community online in any way come at the cost of the community that we have in physical terms? So I'm thinking in particular over the last year, yes, you and I in terms of trying as best we can to be business as usual in getting things converted to being online, but we've also seen some really interesting examples of community building outdoors, haven't we? Like the clapping for the NHS, and this sense of we are in it together, we are going through this adversity, and we will come together for the shared experience. What are your thoughts on that, Nicky?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, and that with a lot of things here, I don't think there is a one size fits all, but I do think it's really, really important to remember, did the community start in face-to-face that then has evolved online because it's had to, or has it been seeded from online and completely virtual? And the two are very different, because even when you look at onboarding, if you've met somebody in your team and you've had the opportunity to be with them and build a team, and then you go fully digital, you've already established trust and knowledge, and you know each other, and you've got a sense of each other, and those micro interactions that happen when you're together, whether that's physical sort of prompts that you see from somebody, or those smaller serendipitous organic conversations that happen that you don't schedule. They happen when you're grabbing a coffee, or you're on your way out to the car park, or whatever that might be, versus I've never actually met that individual because we've only ever seen each other through a screen. And I think the two are very different, and they build differently, but what we tend to try to do is force them into one. I think as we move out of the pandemic, we're then in a place where that you can have that blend of where it's purposeful, it's event driven, it's a sense of experience and shared experience that might be emotional, or it's a celebration, or it's a time to come together, versus actually we're just sitting on a screen with headphones in, even though we're in the same space. And that for me is where that's not intentional. We've fallen into those habits of digital, but then we come together and we still try to force digital in face to face. And I think that from a community sense, both in the workplace and education, will be interesting to see how hybrid gets that right, in a sense of when you've got people at home dialing in, and then you've got people in a physical space together. That's again very different to either we're all in it together because we're physically here, or we're all digital. And I think, you tend to see this, if somebody is dialing in, everybody just looks up at the screen. So they lose that body language and connection with each other, because we're just reverting to the digital medium in the room. There's some brilliant, interesting stuff coming out from the likes of Google of how they're engineering their office spaces to really, really embrace hybrid, so that screens are at, shoulder level rather than everybody looking up. So that work pods can be established and people can come together and have people on screens in the same space. They've got these campfire ideas of meetings that is about, again, it's about that community and that sense of togetherness, but includes those that are perhaps dialing in or on virtual platforms, which I think is then so important when we look at diversity and inclusion, that we don't then start to lose those voices that have been enabled and opened up, just because we're saying actually everybody has to be in a physical space, or everybody has to be within the room and physically there. And I think it's going to be an interesting period of time to take the lessons that we've learned and realize that there isn't one size fits all, realize that it will evolve, it will adapt, and it will change for the people that either in your communities or your places of work or even your personal communities. It'll change and it'll adapt, and that's because people are different, the topics are different, the situation will be different. And I think the more we communicate with each other, especially across communities, and we're honest about what we're learning and what we're going through, I think that communication's key to how we get this right and how we don't just fall back to the habits of days gone by where we go, well, it's just easier to do this.
I absolutely agree with that. And you mentioned the term onboarding. Now, onboarding, I imagine, is something that was done previously in kind of bringing somebody new into an organisation, but that it's taken on a different guise. And I'd like to hear more as to how that's been achieved in digital terms. Because to me, it strikes a chord in relation to the induction that we give our students, and the induction to some degree can be about introducing them to the process and so on, but actually in a different way now, especially moving towards a blended learning model, that has to be a little bit different, so that goes beyond the processes and the policies, that it becomes a point of embracing new students, new consumers in a commercial setting into that community. And just going back also to the point that I made earlier about, moving from one community to the other, and this idea that I just hung up on one group and then entered into this new group, and the fact that we're transitioning from one community to the other. And that's something that's really topical in education terms, is how we are supporting students to transition perhaps from one level to the other, from one discipline to the other. And I think there's a lot there about multimodal learning or multimodal experiences, isn't there? So could you talk me through a bit about the onboarding experiences that you've seen, particularly the ones that are successful, but also the ones that may not have been that successful over the last year, and what learning can you take forward from that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and there's some people that have done it brilliantly, and there's people that are still figuring that out, and it will continually evolve. And I think the thing we need to remember is when that's virtual, the sense of actually community earlier is so important, because if you don't know what you don't know, which is one of my favorite sayings ever, is how do you connect with somebody that's gone through that experience either just recently or is in it with you, or who do you ask when it's that stupid question that you're not sat next to somebody to go, I really don't know how to do X, Y, or Z. Yeah, like who do I speak to? And I think if people can have that shared experience, because it is unknown and it is, how do you bring people together to take that continued learning? And I love the idea that through onboarding, the person that's just gone before you lets you know something that they learned in their first week that was absolutely, really, really valuable to them and that they want to share. So you get this kind of relay race of knowledge and information.
A mentoring system in place there.
Yeah. I think you could keep it a bit looser than mentoring, but I think absolutely the principle of you've got a buddy or you've got somebody to talk to that can share that knowledge with you. And I find that really interesting what you mentioned there around how we can switch from these different communities that we're part of, and the nature and the pace that we're working at the moment doesn't allow for that gap. So you're switching from community learning and to across the different groups, and much like we tend to go meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, actually, how do we enable that pause? How do we enable those moments of thought and reflection? How do we enable that time to just digest a little bit and then come back to the community with a point of view? Or
because moving from those different communities, and I think there was a lot of talk about this in the first place, when we were connecting with our families and friends, as well as trying to work at the same time in these online communities. And people were overwhelmed by the fact that they were transitioning. And it was almost like you would speak and behave differently with your family, So that kind of identity would formulate as you were pulling up to your parents, for example, because you almost a different identity to your professional identity. But the reality is that transitioning didn't take a physical form, and instead you were taking every single community transition from your seat inside your study or your lounge space. So there was a danger to begin with that was overwhelming, and I have to admit to being one of these people who really capitalized on the fact that I didn't need to allow an hour to travel to get to a certain meeting. So I would end up, and to a certain degree I still do, I end up going from one meeting to the other. And you're right to say that there isn't that ability to stop and think and reconfigure, recalibrate maybe the identity that you're taking into that new community. And I think the pause button is the pause really important, because I have recently been thinking, you know, today I just need to press that big red button and pause and stop that hurly-burly action of moving from one thing to the other.
I think it's that one to another, and also the way that it's how we communicate with each other. So within one communal group that you're part of, you might use certain tools where you're very back and forth, and you know each other a lot more. So, you know, you can drop some of the sense of professionalism or the way that you communicate and so on. Whereas you might move to another group where actually it is a little bit more formal because you haven't got that sense of relationship, or the topic's different, or the medium's different. And I do think that time to pause is so important. And I guess over the next 12 months we're gonna figure out this next step and this next journey and how that continues to evolve. And I just really, really hope we don't.
My thoughts on this then is, you know, it's really interesting to have this conversation today. And I've said to you previously, you know, we would never have connected otherwise. However, what I'm learning such a lot here as to those lessons that we can apply from one sector or from one aspect of life, I guess, into another. And over the last year, I've been really fortunate in that I've been able to connect with people that I would have said, okay, well, let's catch up next summer, because maybe they've moved to another country, or it wouldn't have been possible to connect with them quite so frequently. And I've been able to bounce off ideas about learning design with colleagues from further afield than I would normally be able to. So it's been really fascinating to hear your thoughts, and I'm already thinking about what lessons I can take forward from your experiences into my teaching. Because ultimately, when we are preparing students for the working world, we need to be sharing these experiences, you know, and seeing the transferability of behaviorism, I guess, from different areas. On that point, I just wondered whether you had any thoughts actually on, because we've spoken about the physical communities and the importance of connecting, because we can see the whites of people's eyes, I guess, as opposed to personalities. Some personalities been able to translate better online than others. One of the things that was really quite a topical subject when we first moved online in education terms was uses of cameras, and how it was quite demoralizing for some teachers to be faced with in Teams, you know, a page full of initials as opposed to actual faces. And I just wondered whether your experiences were similar in that regard, because my approach to this, and I've spoken already about my pedagogy of compassion, I know that there will be reasons why my students don't want to appear on camera that day, whether it's for personal reasons, whether it's because of their self-esteem, that, you know, all of these things about not wanting to share their home community because it can be intrusive. And so I wondered what your experiences was of that, because you must have overcome that with new colleagues coming on board. How comfortable were they with that? I think it goes back to what we've said already. Any interaction online has to be purposeful. So I've built teaching activities so that they can see the benefit of appearing on screen, and only then can we persuade them over that continuum, if you like, of not wanting to show themselves on screen, not seeing the point of it, all the way through to there's a purpose to this, and I can gain something from appearing in that community.
Yeah, I totally agree. And firstly, Emma, apologies for any loud banging that you started to hear. Of course, next door have started putting up scaffolding just when we're doing this recording. Why would they not?
Well, these are the things that we've had to the learning community with the last year. I mean,
to deal with, right?
It's a wonder my dog hasn't made an appearance so far.
And this is the thing, isn't it? When we invite people into our homes, that's figuratively and literally, like, you know, you're here with me as scaffolding is going up. And I think as soon as we start to communicate to people as to why, so I have a problem with kind of camera always on organizations, that they're doing that in a monitoring sense, because I feel like that becomes very big brother and you lose the angle of why. Whereas I think if that's about community and that's about body language, that's about expression and passion and making sure that people are still engaged and you're not losing people, because that can happen really quickly in a face-to-face room, right? We all learn at a different pace. People might not want to just sort of put their hand up and say, actually, can you cover that again? Because I've not got the foundation of knowledge here that you perhaps think I have. So I think if it's explained as to why we want cameras on and we want to enable that connection that, as you rightly say, is really purposeful and intentional. It's not just, we're doing it so, that we can check you there, or you're not in your pajamas or whatever that might be. But it's communicated as to why. I think it's hugely important, because you do lose, even not being in the same room as somebody, you lose that physical connection and that small body language and micro interactions that happen. And then if you strip that away again, when pulling all the way back, we're talking about human beings, we're talking about experience, we're talking about spirit and shared community and shared purpose. That's very difficult to translate through just text or just voice. I'm not saying it's not possible across a breadth of mediums, but it's about how you mix those mediums together, I think. And if the point is you want in video, and you're not just wanting a audio call or a clubhouse room, the purpose is video and the purpose is connection, or the purpose is coming together in a physical space that then isn't just people sitting with headphones on and sitting side by side, but still engaging across digital. So I think, again, it's about what's right for the situation, and that there isn't that one size fits all. Have you seen that with students, though, that there's a want to perhaps not have a camera on either all the time or even full stop? There's
been a real reticence to have the cameras on, I think, generally speaking. But I think that from a learning designer perspective, I often think that the onus to turn that around is down to us. I mean, I created a game show for my students whereby there was a purpose to them having the cameras on, because they had to show items to the screen. And I thought it was quite disingenuous to just say to students, you need to be in this classroom and you need to appear on screen. We've got to make it purposeful, and also be compassionate at the same time to individual circumstances. So when you say, there'll be a reason for them not wanting to show their homes or to show themselves on a particular day, we've got to be understanding and empathetic to those circumstances. I'm also thinking about, the diversity of our student body, whereby you might have a person who has caring or parenting responsibilities, and they would be more inclined to maybe chip into that, come to that session of a day, whereas under normal circumstances they say, I can't make today's session because I need to look after my child. So I think that we've got to set our own parameters as well, in that we are, you drew upon a lot of the themes that we've touched upon today in your response there. And another one is this pausing, the pressing on the button and saying, do you know what, it's okay, I'm available today, but I can't physically connect today. I can't bring my brain to connect because I'm exhausted, or I've got other things going on, and it's okay. I think we've got to be compassionate to ourselves in that regard is really important. And that point you made about foundational knowledge and assumptions of foundational knowledge, and maybe the body language not translating online in the same way, so that you can, look a bit miffed at certain points, and then people check, oh, you didn't understand that. Can we go back to that? That's all the more difficult when actually maybe all you see is 9 members of your group on screen. So you don't know who's not with you. And to go back to our original analogy is, who's not made it back on the bus before that bus leaves town? And so it's so important to check in. And a part of the connectivity that we've been talking about today, I think, is about just saying, that broader question is anybody out there? So you may not be connecting at the same time, like I gave the example of a like or a reaction to an online post from somebody in a different time zone. But it's important to make sure that we are on the same page as we would achieve in a classroom or in a training room, by simply saying, right, are we all okay? And it's important that we do find ways, I think, in an online community to achieve that same end, but that we're at the same time flexible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the sort of the key there, isn't it? It's flexibility. It's that there isn't one size fits all. And I think the future of work enables distributed workforces, which enables more talent, it enables more diversity. And it's the same with learning communities. It's the same with education. It's the same with the community you're part of, that digital enables this breadth, right? It enables more people, broader lens, wider geographical locations. Time zones don't become a problem because we are all in this shared virtual space. But I think it's about that intentional connection when that comes face to face, or the intent behind virtual, or the behind the blend, and how do we communicate that with people and constantly adapt, pivot and change, and embrace that in this new future of true hybrid. But it's one I'm excited for anyway.
I'm equally excited, and I'm particularly excited as of today to take forward the lessons I've learned from conversing with you about these things, because I don't know that I was that conscious before that there are lessons to be learned from our general lives, whether it's online banking or asking for tech support because our machinery has created an error or something, and how we can take lessons from those interactions into the learning community. Because actually, is it not the case that we're always learning, whether it's social interaction in the shop? It's always a learning experience. So now that everything has some digital element to it, I think there is such transferability. But I love the fact that we share that same philosophy of, we've got to make it personal, let's make it count, and if we're gonna connect, let's take something forward from it. And I'm certainly taking a lot forward from having spoken to you today, Nicky. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. I absolutely loved it, and thanks, Andrew, for the opportunity for having us both.
I really hope you enjoyed that chat as much as I did. There's a phrase I use, and this chat fits that perfectly, which is that it was so far up my street it's parked in my front garden. There are elements here across tribes, belonging, community, asynchronous, that I'm going to have to go back to many times. This was such a great conversation to be part of, and just sitting in the room and just being able to absorb the conversation was just wonderful. Massive thanks to Nicky and Emma for such a sparkling and informed conversation. If you want to be a guest, or know someone else who might want to be a guest, please let us know. We're going to be recording again soon, and we've got some great areas to be discussed. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon. You have been listening to the Women Talking About Learning podcast. Women Talking About Learning is available on all podcast platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts. You'll also find us on Spotify, Amazon Music, and other music streaming services. Make sure to like and subscribe. It helps more people find us. You can find out more about Women Talking About Learning via our website, womentalkingaboutlearning.com. Make sure you tune in next time for more women talking about learning, for more of the signal and none of the noise.